I'm gonna sample it for my next album.
I'm gonna Shazam this right now.
I'm gonna sample it for my next album.
Just keep repeating that. I'm gonna sample it for my next album.
Okay, welcome everyone. We're gonna let everyone join. I'm just kind of just take a minute here. I'm gonna fill some space while the room is populated. My name is Tyler Shipley. I'll introduce myself again in a moment, but I'm the moderator for tonight's event, hosted by Between the Lines Publishing, and this, of course, I assume you all know. You are here for the book launch for Testimonio, Canadian Mining in the Aftermath of Genocides in Guatemala, a book edited by Catherine Nolin and Grahame Russell, who are both with us tonight, as well as a number of other speakers and contributors to the book. I've read it. It's fantastic. It is a really, really important piece of work. So there's a lot that we will say about it in the coming 70 to 90 minutes, which is approximately the time we will take tonight. We're going to have a sort of a pretty hard cutoff at around 8:30 Eastern or 5:30 Pacific, because we've all got other things to do. But I think there's going to be a lot of really important and really valuable insight and analysis in the ensuing hour and a half. So as people sort of continue to filter in, I will just say again that my name is Tyler Shipley, and I am the moderator of this event. And I'm really, really grateful to Catherine and Grahame and everyone for asking me, because this work in this book is so important, and it connects with work that I've done. I've recently published a book on Canadian foreign policy. It's called Canada in the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination, and it is about Canada's relationships around the world, including its relationships with Indigenous nations. Needless to say, it is a book critical of those relationships and critical of Canada. And I think this book, Testimonio, adds a really, really important piece to that overall story. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm really glad that there are so many of you with us tonight. I am going to turn it over now to David Gray Donald from Between the Lines to say a few words from the publisher.
Thanks so much, Tyler. So yeah, we're really excited about this book, and really grateful to you, Tyler, to be moderating tonight. Tyler also published a book with Between the Lines called Ottawa and Empire, Canada and the Military Coup in Honduras. And I'm also reading Canada in the World and Testimonio at the same time right now, and it's just amazing work coming out about Canadian foreign policy and Canadian government and corporate meddling around the world. Between the Lines is super proud to be publishing Testimonio today. It continues a long tradition that Between the Lines has of publishing about Canadian mining. In fact, the Between the Lines was founded in 1977, and the first book published was called The Big Nickel. It's about Inco at home and abroad, and the Phoenix mine in Guatemala is featured in that book. So 44 years later, we're coming full circle with Testimonio. And I want to also mention that I'm going to post in the chat a blog post we did with a number of our mining books. And we're putting all of those books in that list on sale at 40% off today with the code Testimonio. And just another little plug, the more books you buy, the cheaper the shipping is, and then shipping is free over $100. So load up on mining books. One other little story, when Mining Injustice came out by Joan Koyak, at one of the book launches, some plainclothes RCMP officers showed up, So I just want to say hi to our friends in national security who might be joining today, employees at mining companies. Welcome. We hope you learned something. And I think that's it for me. I'm going to post about the sale and about the code for our mining books in the chat. I'm going to pass it back to Tyler. Really looking forward to this conversation. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, David. Hello to any of those interlocutors that may have joined us for that reason. You're now going to be treated to an hour and a half of, I think, really deep and insightful analysis. So congratulations on being with us for that. I'm going to quickly introduce everyone who's going to speak, and we're going to read very short bios for everyone. Each speaker is going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. I think Catherine and Grahame will take a little longer, closer to 10 minutes to really sort of flesh out what they want to add. As we go through, when people want to ask questions, I would encourage you to throw them into the chat or into the Q&A section. I will kind of keep an eye on both of those, and I'm just going to kind of collate them as things move along. I'll try to track them and then pass those questions along at the end. We'll do the Q&A session at the end after everyone has made their comments. So let me just introduce you to the panelists, who I think you can probably see on your screen. Catherine Nolin is a professor of geography and chair of the Department of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George. In 2020, Catherine was elected chair of the Conference of Latin American Geography, CLAG, for a 2-year term. This is the premier geographic organization for geographers engaging in research in Latin America and the Caribbean, and works to foster research, education, and service related to Latin American geographical studies. Catherine is also a longtime researcher and, perhaps most importantly, social justice advocate who has been grappling with the afterlives of the Guatemalan genocides for more than 25 years. Before I turn it over to Catherine, I'm going to actually run through everyone's bio just so that you have those. That way, once we start, things will sort of flow together. So Grahame Russell, my old friend, is a non-practicing Canadian lawyer, and since 1995, he's been director of Rights Action, phenomenal organization which works in Honduras and Guatemala in support of community, environmental, human rights, and territory defenders, resisting widespread harms and often deadly violence caused by different sectors of the global economy, from mining, hydroelectric, African palm, sugarcane, bananas, coffee, tourism, you name it. Rights Action carries out education and activism work in the US and Canada, focusing on how our governments and companies and the US military often contribute directly to and benefit from human rights violations, environmental harms, exploitation, corruption, and impunity, much of which we'll discuss tonight. Grahame is also an adjunct professor in the geography program at UNBC. Later, we will also be joined by other contributors to the book, including Jackie Mcbicker, who has accompanied human rights social movements and land protectors in Central America for more than 15 years. She's worked in communications, advocacy, and adult education with the Guatemala Human Rights Commission, United for Mining Justice, and the Maritimes Guatemala Breaking the Silence Network, in addition to work as a freelance writer for publications such as American Magazine and the NACLA Report for the Americas, both very important and valuable journals. James Rodríguez is a documentary photographer based in Guatemala since 2006, and I believe he's actually coming to us tonight live from Guatemala. James's work focuses on social issues in Latin America, but primarily post-war Guatemala, transitional justice processes, land tenure conflicts due to extractive industries, human rights abuses, and the effects of the internal war in its daily life. And James is currently represented by Panos Pictures. Emily Smith is an Argentine-born Canadian Anglican priest and theologian. Since 1984, she has walked with the peoples of Guatemala. Emily is the co-president of SICSAL, Servicio Internacional Cristiano de Solidaridad con los Pueblos de América Latina, the Oscar Romero Liberation Theology Network, a Christian solidarity network with the people of Latin America, founded in the months after St. Romero's death. And finally, Corey Wanless is a Toronto-based lawyer who represents 13 Maya Kekchi in precedent-setting lawsuits, which I'm sure we will discuss tonight, lawsuits against Canadian company Hudbay Minerals regarding human rights abuses in Guatemala in the cases that we will be talking about tonight. So Those are your speakers. Those are your panelists. It is a phenomenal array of speakers that we have lined up for you tonight. So without any further ado from me, I will just remind you that questions and comments can be thrown into the chat, and I will track those questions so that at the end I can pass those on to the panelists. And from there, I will turn it over to Grahame. Grahame, I'll give you up to 10 minutes to tell us what is going on, especially given what happened, what is happening right now in El Estor, which I'm sure people will want to hear about.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Tyler, for kicking this off. And just some very brief thanks. Firstly, thanks to Catherine for the 17 years of coursework we've done together, taking your University of Northern British Columbia learning trips, study trips to Guatemala. And that's an ongoing course, and I look forward to the next one. And then out of that came this book. And so thank you for getting this book to the finish line twice. I'd like to give a special thanks to Between the Lines, because this book was rejected first or quashed by another publisher, and that'll be part of the story that'll come out tonight. And there's a preface in the book Testimonio about how it was unceremoniously quashed by a publisher, Springer Nature, in Europe at the last second. And there's a very complicated and probably nefarious story behind that. And then Between the Lines picked this up, and here we are. I'd like to give a special thanks to Corey and Murray. I've had the great honor of working with them as the Toronto-based lawyers, Corey Wanless and Murray Klippenstein. Hopefully Corey can join us tonight, for their role in the working on the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits, which are also addressed in the book. And these are fundamentally hugely important lawsuits. Mostly, I just give my thanks and want to honor all the people whose lives are documented in the book. We'll be talking about some of them tonight, but some of their testimonies are in the book. Some of their stories they're interviewed in many of the different articles in the book. But they are the people that fundamentally we are writing a book like this for, because they are the ones that are suffering just systemic harms and violations, generation in and generation out, related to not only Canadian mining companies, but mining companies from many countries. And so they are the ones that I most give thanks to. What do I think this book's about? And I say this from my perspective as working on these community defense struggles for the past 17 or 18 years, the mining related ones, with Rights Action. So my whole perspective on this book comes through my work with Rights Action. I think this book is two things. One I think is it is truthful, fact-based reporting and analysis. And we not only write and or publish or republish articles related to 4 different mining related struggles that I'll talk about briefly, but I think it's truthful. I don't think this is far-fetched in any way, shape, or form, and we stand by the facts in the case. And I think that the analysis, the overall analysis of each piece, but the analysis that Catherine and I bring to it is also the correct analysis. So I think it is truthful information about some very serious issues. And then what it is a contribution to much needed struggle and work for full political, legal, and media accountability in Canada. And I think that's the other main focus of this book, is it's about continuing with work and struggle in Canada to bring about full accountability for our role in this. As Tyler said at the outset, Rights Action works on a wide range of community defense struggles, not just related to mining, but also related to dams, African palm production, sugarcane. There should be testimonials written for every one of these community defense struggles. And in that sense, mining is just one more sector of the unjust global economic order. And this book's about mining, but these stories play themselves out in many different sectors of the global economy. As part of the work with Rights Action, as I said, we are heavily involved in the 4 different mining related struggles documented in this book. 2 of them we've been funding and supporting the community defenders since 2004, 2 others since 2012. The older struggles are that of Hudbay Minerals and Gold Corp Inc. that began in 2004. The more recent ones began in 2012 or broke out in the open in 2012 and are related to Tahoe Resources and then KCA/Radius Gold. During these years, some of the corporate ownership has changed. And then, as has already been referred to, in the case of Hudbay Minerals, the backstory of that case actually goes back to the early 60s, soon after the US-backed military coup in 1954, when the Canadian giant Inco got involved. The Hudbay Minerals story that's playing itself out so brutally today as we speak has its roots all the way back in the 60s, when the Canadian government supported the expansion of Inco into these Mayan Quechua territories of eastern Guatemala. But those are the 4 different mining struggles related, documented in the book. And Rights Action's work is a combination of both direct funding and providing supports to the community defenders. They're both Indigenous and non-Indigenous community defenders. And then our work is that of doing education work in Canada on the mining issue, and then participating with many other people and groups in Canada to bring about accountability. And before I get into the accountability, on the truth-telling side, what each of these these mining-related struggles have in common, and I'll just make some generalizations here. But each one of these struggles has the following elements in common. All of them are characterized by a fundamental lack of democracy in the country. And I can say a lot more about that. And I emphasize that point simply because the Canadian government insists over and over and over that we're dealing with our democratic ally, the government of Guatemala, and the companies themselves claim on their websites that they're dealing with this democratically elected government of Guatemala. And I believe that that's fundamentally untrue. So there's a fundamental lack of democracy in the country. There's systemic and corruption and impunity that characterize most of the institutions of the state: the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judiciary, the police, and the military. There's widespread corruption existing in all of these institutions, and it plays itself out in the mining struggles themselves. Then, once you start the mining-related issues, all of the licenses, the so-called mining licenses, have been acquired by Canadian companies and companies from other countries through questionable, if not illegal means. Like, they're actually illegal mining operations because they don't have a valid operating license. That's not identical in each case, it's slightly different, but there's a fundamental lack of legal operating license to begin with. And then when the mining companies show up, they are imposed through corruption and or violence as a general rule. They're supported by the Guatemalan military and police when they come to tell people they have to get off their lands because the lands are owned by a mining company and they are not the legal owners of their own land. And then the problems ensue from there and just follow one after the other. There's oftentimes forced violent evictions. There's tactics of coercion used to get people off their land. And then there's all kinds of pressures to get people off the land and buy their land so that the mining company can start mining. Once the mining starts, which is true in some of the mining struggles and not others, there's been widespread documentation of environmental harms and then health harms to human life and to animal life. And then when the people stand up to defend their rights, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people stand up to defend their lands, their human rights and their environment, they get targeted for human rights violations, they get targeted for repression, and some of them have been killed. And some of those stories are documented in the book. Those are generalizations I just made, but every one of the mining struggles documented in the book has those characteristics to one degree or another. I just want to quickly mention 2 people. On the front cover of the book is a woman named Diodora Hernandez. She is a Mayan Mam region from the Gold Corp affected regions of Western Guatemala. Her story is extraordinary. It's documented in part in the film called Gold Fever. And one night in July of 2010, she refused to sell her land to Gold Corp. She would not give in to the pressures and tactics. And 2 men tried to assassinate her one night, coming up to her in her remote hut in the middle of her fields on her land and pretending to ask for a cup of coffee. They shot her point blank in the head. And this is a true story. And the bullet went in her eye and came out her ear. And how these things occur, I have no understanding. And yet there she lives today, and she refuses to sell her land today. And she is just one more of the extraordinary people in this story. On the back cover, there's already been reference to the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits. There's five or six Indigenous women in their community. And these are 5 of the 11 Mcbicker women who were gang raped as part of an illegal forced eviction in 2007. And all of that's related to the Hudbay Minerals / Sky Resources lawsuits. These are some of the stories that are in the book. And there's many more stories documented. And then just to get outside the book for a second, it was briefly referred to that there's been a recent explosion of mining related violence in Guatemala that's going on right now as we hold this event, and it's affecting the Mcbicker region of Guatemala. So these very women who are in the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits, their lives are being once again turned upside down. And many people in Canada will have heard of the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits, and the Angelica Choc, who's the widow of Adolfo Ish, was assassinated, of Herman Chub, the young man in a wheelchair who was shot and paralyzed, and then these 11 women who were raped. They're all the 13 plaintiffs in the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits that Corey Wanless and Marie Klippensteins are working on. The last 3 days have been extraordinary levels of violence against the Kekchi people in Alastor. Our friends there, and then many other grassroots organizations who have been protesting yet again the illegal operation of this nickel company, whose roots go back to Inco in the 60s and 70s, passes through Sky Resources and Hudbay in the 2000s and 2010s, and then Hudbay sells it to a Swiss-based company, Slow Investment Group, who's doing pretty much all of the same things. We could get into that in the question and answer period, but there's been a heavy-handed crackdown that's happening right now by the Guatemalan military and police. There's heavily armed soldiers and robocops that have invaded the entire area. They're going house to house. They're looking for people. They're illegally searching people's homes. And people that we know and are documented in the book, they are fleeing literally into the mountains to escape being detained by the repressive forces. And the government has completely sided with the mining company and the illegal operation of the mine. And they've imposed a military state of siege for 30 days in that region. It's just, and what is happening right now in Alastor is just one more story of what's documented in the book. And so this book is basically not a history book, though a lot, this is recent history. It happens on an ongoing basis today. We can come back to that story in the question and answer if people want. So beyond the truth telling, and I think we have a correct analysis in the book. This is a book about accountability in Canada, but the accountability, and I'm going to wind this up pretty soon, Tyler. The accountability that we and many other people and groups are fighting for in Canada is based on a fundamental sort of reframing of the notion, and that these issues in Guatemala are not Guatemalan problems, that these are Canadian problems. This is not Guatemalan corruption and impunity. This is Canadian companies with, I believe, the full knowledge of the Canadian government choosing to operate in these conditions and then contributing to and benefiting from corruption and impunity. That is Canadian corruption and impunity. When the repression happens, whether it's carried out by Guatemalan soldiers, police, or private security guards, that is not Guatemalan repression. That is Canadian private company repression in partnership with Guatemalan soldiers and police. But that is Canadian repression and human rights violations. When there's environmental harms, which have been particularly pronounced in the Goldcorp struggle and in the Hudbay mineral struggles, that is Canadian environmental damage being foisted on Mother Earth in those regions. And when there's health harms to people and animal life, that is Canadian health harms. And with that slight reframing of the issues, but a very important one, that is where the accountability work has to go in Canada. And there's a major accountability gap in Canada across the board. The Canadian government is fully supporting this model of economic development, they call it, supporting the expansion of our mining companies in numerous ways, while turning a blind eye to, or sometimes openly denying that these types of harms are happening, just in these 4 cases alone, let alone in other countries around the world. Canadian corporations are knowingly operating in these conditions. They are taking advantage of and contributing to the corruption and impunity repression, environmental harm, etc. And they're doing so knowingly. And there's few ways to hold them legally or politically accountable in Canada. And the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits are an exception to that. But I think they're almost an exception to the rule of impunity and then immunity from liability. It is a media accountability issue in Canada, with some exceptions, some recent exceptions, particularly related only to the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits. The Canadian media is not doing its job properly to investigate and report on the depth of these systemic issues, not just in Guatemala, but in many countries around the world. And then to finish off this sort of section, I think it's also, or to repeat one point, or two last points, it's also an investor issue in Canada, because Canadian investors, let alone investors from many countries around the world, are heavily invested in the mining industry. This is public pension funds and private sector investors, and there is no responsibility in the investment industry to take into consideration human rights violations, repression, environmental harms, etc., corruption and impunity. The only fundamental criteria they have is to maximize profits. That is a challenge to our laws and our values. We need to reform and challenge and change those. And then lastly, and coming back to this point, we just need serious legal reform, both in the criminal law sector and in the civil law sector, at a bare minimum, to enable many more civil lawsuits like the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits, and particularly criminal investigations into these issues, to start holding company management and boards of directors accountable for if and when they contribute to these types of harms and violations in other countries and benefit from them. That's what I think the book's about. Tyler, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Graham. Certainly everything you've said in the last few minutes in particular really resonates for me, and it's probably something that I'll want to come back to at the end to talk more about, the way in which these are Canadian problems. And I've actually seen a question pop up in the chat that relates to that very well, which by the way, I'll remind everyone that please continue to just throw your questions into the chat. They can be questions for individual panelists or for everyone. I'm keeping track of them, I'm collecting them, and when we get to the end, after all of the speakers are finished, I'm going to bring those questions back up and put them in front of the panel. So the last one was a very good one that I'm glad to see and that I will happily be passing along. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine Nolin to, again, sort of introduce the book and give us some of the key thoughts and key things that we should be taking from it.
Great. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Graham, for that introduction to the key takeaways of the book and our thinking behind pulling it all together, and what we need to be thinking forward when we're listening to the contributors who are joining us here tonight. So first, I want to give, as Graham already has said, but I think we can't overstate how grateful we are to Between the Lines for reaching out to us when Springer Nature at the very last minute sent us a termination contract and told us that they wouldn't move forward with the book because it was full of defamatory content and unsubstantiated material, but provided no evidence of that, which is very strange for an academic publisher. And as Graham says, we were asked by Between the Lines to write a preface to the book. And so we give some detail to that strange situation that we still don't know much about. But we do know that they wouldn't move forward at the last minute, and through some media attention to, a just kind of outcry against this kind of quashing of truthful information, that Between the Lines approached us. And here we are about a year later, or maybe less than a year later. Amazing. So thank you to the whole team, who many of you I think are online here. We're really grateful. Before I dive into some of my other comments about this great team that have contributed to the book over many, many years, I do want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Lheidli T'enneh here in northern British Columbia, where I work at the University of Northern British Columbia. And I also want to acknowledge and share my respect for the Maya and Xinca people and their territories, where we have worked and continue to work over these many years. And I think it is important to make these acknowledgements because our work is done in solidarity with Indigenous people and lands, those people who are defenders, community members, as the book outlines, who have been criminalized, attacked, imprisoned, murdered, raped, totally disrespected, for their resistance to this imposed so-called development model where violence is used to implement these kinds of projects. And so we've worked in solidarity for all these many years to work for justice and accountability. And that really is the call of the book, is to bring that to attention of Canadians. The book is really directed in a way at Canadians, so that we all know better what's going on. And so I think I'm arriving here in a way with a heavy heart. I'm excited and thrilled the book is here and published today. But as Grahame mentioned, so many of the people that we work with, it's just gutting to know what's happening on the ground. And I haven't been back to Guatemala since March of 2020, right before the pandemic meant travel was extremely difficult and hard. So I haven't been back, but the critical work of independent journalists and community journalists, Guatemala-based journalists, Indigenous journalists in the country it's just so critical. And they are sharing with us that though this is a situation that's happening on the ground connected to the Phoenix mine in one part of the country in El Estor, if we look beyond the one location, what is really amazing and maybe different from when the events that we've documented in the book, something that might be different now is that Indigenous authorities, ancestral authorities, are mobilizing all across the country, and they are showing up in El Estor to be with those who are in resistance to what's going on with the mine, as described by Grahame, but also in the capital. And so ancestral authorities from all sorts of parts of the country and quiet places have made their way to the Central Plaza and are there asking for the stepping down of many of the people who are responsible for this, and backing the claims of those on the ground. And so knowing what's happening to the community members in El Estor, that's not documented, but what has been shared with Grahame is weighing heavy on us as we're meeting here tonight. Maybe I might ask if Devin is in the background there, if you wouldn't mind putting up the image of the collaborators. I wanted to share with you, the Testimonio is made up of contributions of journalists, academics, filmmakers, documentary photographer, James Rodríguez, community members, you name it. It just a richness of people who are committed to these issues and who have shared their contributions, making this a really strong contribution, I think. So the book is called Testimonio, and I might take one moment to really give you a sense of what we mean by testimonio. It's a critical word and a critical way of doing research on these kinds of issues. So testimonio versus the English language testimony is really a collective remembrance, a collective sharing of usually difficult and violent events in their communities. And gathering the voices of people on the ground that you see here. All of these folks have contributed to the book. Means that we're working in solidarity, that we listen more than we ask. We are there to meet people where they are, which usually means meeting in their communities, on the land, on the roadsides, hiking into their communities, being with them and listening and sharing. And I'm sharing their images here with their permission. I think that's always really important to mention, that their names, faces, the locations where they live are included in the book because they've requested that. They've requested that we amplify their voices and share the experiences of dealing with mainly Canadian owned mining operations in their lands and communities. I also want to share that there are some, collaborators who are here with us tonight, and a couple are having a little difficulty joining us, but I hope that will be resolved shortly. I think both Jackie and Corey are now connected, which is great. But there are some other key people who I know are online, but they won't be speaking necessarily tonight, but I do want to mention them. One is Camilla Reach, who is Grahame's daughter, who is an amazing person who has worked with us since we connected with Between the Lines to gather this all together, to work with us, to get the book in shape and get us to the finish line. And so she's in our acknowledgements as having the superpowers to help us get to this point. So Camilla, thank you so much for all your efforts. The other is George Lovell, Professor George Lovell from Queen's University, who was my academic supervisor for my master's and my PhD, who has done his own amazing work over many decades in Guatemala. And he wrote the foreword to the book, and we're really grateful for his long-term commitment and to do that for us, to be part of this work. And the next, it will be the next person who's speaking, but we won't turn to him quite yet, but James Rodríguez, who is online with us and will be speaking tonight. James, like Grahame, have been such great friends who have been with this project since the very beginning, when I showed up in one of our minivans with a paper proposal with maybe we could do a book like this, and gather together the work of people we'd worked with for so many years. How might we do this? And James has been such a generous spirit. And so his work is threaded throughout the whole book, and he'll share with you some of that tonight. Maybe a final slide that, Devin, if you have that one other image, I might just put up there before I turn it back over to Tyler. If it's not there, that's fine. I think what I wanted to end my point on is there's so much in this book that will be shared by many of the contributors. I just want to end with my comments with, I think, this one takeaway point that's the beginning of our book and at the end of the book, and I think it's critical. This is an image of the Phoenix mine processing plant on the shores of Lake Isabel outside of El Estor, a mine that is supposed to be, have its operation ceased while consultation takes place. And it has, I think, run for, almost full out in that time. And certainly when we took this image in January of 2020, it was fully going. I think a key takeaway point that we'll come back to over and over again in many ways is that it is based on all of the work that we've gathered. Grahame and I think are quite clear that we can make this statement, that it is not possible to operate a large-scale mine in Guatemala, let alone all of these other large-scale so-called, development projects across many sectors, without participating in and benefiting from human rights violations, without participating and benefiting from repression, participating and benefiting from corruption and impunity. And so, through the book, I think that case is made, and the work then towards the end of the book by people like J.P. LaPlante and Corey Wanless and Marie Klippenstein, of talking about the ways in which we have to move forward, both respecting the on-the-ground consulta processes where communities are stating for themselves if it's a yes or no to these projects, which have been, completely ignored, but also legal accountability in Canada and Guatemala, but particularly in Canada, where decisions are being made about moving forward with these projects. So I think I'll leave my comments there, and I'll be happy to answer questions and so on afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Yeah, there are questions coming in. The chat is alive. There are a lot of questions coming through. So we will come to all of those at the end. We'll give everyone opportunities to respond to these really, really interesting questions that are coming up. But first, I want to turn it over to James Rodríguez. James's reporting and documentary photography on life after genocide runs throughout this incredible book. And in addition, James focuses significant attention to the individual and community level impacts of extraction and foreign mining operations. So James, I hope that you'll be able to share with us, speak to your work with communities in the aftermath of genocide and their relationship and resistance to the extractive industries in Guatemala. So James, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tyler. Well, quick thanks to everyone really involved in this project. This means a lot to me personally. Catherine and Grahame have been great friends and allies for over a decade now, and without them, I think I wouldn't be able to do my own project. And well, just real quick, I'm neither Canadian nor Guatemalan, so but I have been living here now since 2004, pretty much, and I just one thing that I arrived project that was fun. This is my internet is unstable, but I think I might be okay now. And basically, after working here for a year, I was not a photographer yet, but I realized that we have to keep in mind always that Guatemala is a post-war country. Even now, still, it's and of course, 15 years ago, it was even more, the issue. So when I started analyzing and getting involved here in post-war issues, the main reason why the war started was land tenure. Land tenure had been, the issue that kicked off the war, that maintained it. And so in a post-war country, how are land tenure issues being dealt with? And in 2004 was also the year when the two large mines, the Marlin mine in the northern, the western San Marcos department, and then the Yellowstone Phoenix mine was sort of restarting. These were two flash that were just very large. What can a post-war country deal with its past if it's present? It's basically dealing with the same issues that caused the war in itself. So that's when I decided to see if I could attempt and do a more in-depth photographic documentary project, in order really to just bring attention to what was happening. And hopefully, I see photography more as a window or a hook. I call it sometimes a hook to get people interested in really finding out more about certain issues. And I felt it was very important to pay attention to what was happening here in Guatemala. So I decided to stick around, and well, it's been over 15 years now, and I'm still here. But basically, my main project for the past 15 years has been something similar to this, not just focusing on Canadian mining, but how extractive industries, hydroelectric dams, single crop agricultural projects, and the mining, and are basically destabilizing or maybe maintaining the status quo in a way. so it's a real honor to collaborate with everyone in the book. I've worked with in one way or another for the past 15 years. I'm wondering if we could maybe go through some of the images that are in the book, just so you can see a little bit. I'm not going to talk in depth about the images, but here, as I said, it's very important to keep in mind what the context of the country is. It's this is a country reeling from a genocide, from having over 250,000 mostly indigenous Maya people killed through hundreds of massacres and disappearances, forced disappearances. And so most of the communities living the current, let's say, social conflicts have a real past in the war. So that's been some of the mechanisms that are continually used today by the powers that be in order to continue imposing their will as to how land will be used. They're very similar to the ones that were used during the war. A couple of photos back, we saw an eviction that was precisely in a store in 2007, where soldiers came and burned homes. And that was actually an illegal act because after the 96 peace accords, soldiers were not supposed to participate in internal affairs. So for them to come in and burn homes of, what the government called squatters, when in reality they were, Mayan, Kichi, defending their territory. So these, this is basically the same forces pitting against each other. This photo right here is from a different state of siege. This was, I believe, 2013 during a different mine that at that moment was also a Canadian run mining project. It so happens that Canadian capital has at one point or another run through all the major mines here in Guatemala. I find this really interesting because I know that in Canada, I have a lot of Canadian friends, and many of them were always very, sort of rejected the U.S. imperialist, manner. Yet in reality, Canadian mining seems to be very similar in the way it operates overseas. So I thought it was, once again, I was very hopeful that my images would open up minds and hopefully create discussions and, to show the truth visually about what was happening in other places, right? These are some of the plaintiffs as well that are currently in hiding, as Grahame was saying, that the situation in El Estor right now is very, very tense. And so these are women that are part of the Hut Bay Minerals lawsuit in Canada. I'm wondering if there's any more slides, or if that's the last one. As I mentioned, I've basically been working on a long-term photo book that focuses on many of these issues. On these particular, two issues as well. I call it the two pillars, the post-war and the land tenure conflicts that are happening now, to show visually what really is happening here on the ground as much as possible. I'm not sure how much I've spoken, but I think I'm going to leave it at that for now, and maybe leave it open to questions for the end of the chat. Is everyone?
That's great. Thanks so much, James. Yeah, and especially, again, I know I'm a broken record, but what you said about the surprise, that Canadians often have when these things sort of, come back to Canada, that's something that is certainly important to me, and I know we'll come back to that in the discussion. For now, I'm going to turn it over to Emily. The Reverend Emily Smith contributed to the first chapter of the book, Genocides, Legacy on the Land and Dominant Economic Model. And the chapter really centers the testimony. And of course, this is one of the strengths of the book is the testimonies of people in these affected communities. And that chapter indeed centers the testimony of Sebastián Iboy Osorio. And Emily, for many decades, has walked with and witnessed the bravery of survivors, the honorable work of organizations that are trying to, carry out the kind of the process, the post-genocide and post-struggle process, exhuming the remains of people killed during the time of the terror, the search for the disappeared, people missed by their families. So, Emily, I'm sure there's many things you can give us, but one thing that's certainly on my mind would be your contribution and why you think it's important to connect these contemporary mining struggles to those years of genocide, why those two things are so important. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tyler. And so good to see the faces, the old gang. We've been a lot of places, on a lot of buses, and we've slept on a lot of floors and on mountainsides together. And a lot of love is in this book as well. A lot of passion and commitment. Thank you, Tyler, for your question. I think that myself, when Catherine and Grahame were coming up with the idea and they wanted to use this essay that I'd written for another publication, I said, but I've got another idea. And they said, no, we want this one. So it invited me to reflect and to remember that these things are all linked. The past, the deep past, the ancient past, and the contemporary past, what's going on now, is all linked. And I was with James and Catherine and Grahame at that first photo of that we took in Cobang, right, on the military base. Unforgettable images. I think that where I go as a religious leader and as a theologian is deep into the meaning of what is going on at a different level. Deeply appreciative of the folks that are working on the political and the social and the legal. I'm also really interested in the spiritual, obviously, and not just as a Christian, but as a person of faith, and knowing that in Guatemala, a deeply religious country, both in the Christian tradition and in the Mayan tradition, which often is blended. But I'll never forget sleeping, not really sleeping, but lying on the mountain up in Rio Negro, where the genocide had occurred of the massacre of 177 women and children, 107 children and 70 women. And just feeling in that place the presence of those souls still, and knowing that the mountain itself was holding the memory. The mountain itself was holding the grief and the sorrow and the anger of the loss of the murder of these women and children. And it was then that in my kind of North American white European was kind of exploded when I realized that the mountain isn't just a thing. The mountain isn't just there for us to get what we want out of it, but the mountain is a place that holds memory, that holds sorrow, that holds the life of these women and the stories that they carried as well. And I think that is where we end up from coming from this North American or European vision, that the mountain is there for us. It's a product for us to consume. And what the people of Guatemala have taught me, and the Indigenous people in Canada as well, is to confront that at the very deepest level, that the mountain is not there, the trees are not there, the ocean is not there for us to consume, that these things have soul and that we have a responsibility to be in right relationship with all of these things as well. So I think that's what I carry forward, and I'm deeply grateful for the work of everyone and the witness of everyone in this book. And I just got it this morning in the mail, and I'm just gonna sit down and devour it. And the last thing I'd like to say is that in my international work as the international work that I do in all of Latin America, I have seen again and again spray painted on walls this saying "Fuera Canadienses," or "Out with you Canadians." And I know Jackie has the story about when she was working in Guatemala, and she was told to take off her little pin of her Canadian flag. This was during one of the first uprisings around the Goldcorp mine. And just, I've been in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And in every one of these countries, Canada is present in the destruction of people and of mountains, of waters, and of the earth. And that's something that we really have to take into our understanding of who we are and what we've done, and challenge it. Because here I live in the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, now called Vancouver, and it's just shocking to walk around and see the Goldcorp Center for the Arts and the Goldcorp Center for mental health. And I think, my God, I just want to check in. I got to check into the center because I'm losing my mind that Goldcorp has managed to paint itself as the good guys here. So I think that's all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emily. Yeah, there's so much to take from your comments, and again, we will come back to them. There's plenty of questions that have come through, and we're keeping track of all of those. So I'm going to move on to our next panelist, Jackie Mcbicker, who contributed to Chapter 2 of the book alongside Guatemala City-based journalist Sandra Cuff. In her contribution, Jackie shares her perspective on the relationship between the extractive industry projects and those who profit from them, including the United Church Pension Fund, the Canada Pension Plan, and others. Jackie documents this ongoing violence even after mines close, like the Vancouver-based Goldcorp Marlin mine, which we've been talking about, which closed in 2018 but neglected or purposely chose not to share an official closure plan with affected communities. So Jackie, I turn it to you, maybe to speak to what you've seen in your many years of accompaniment work and the need to pay attention to community concerns, even when a mine shuts down.
Thanks, Tyler. Can folks hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up or something? Yay, nay, I can't see, but I'm gonna keep talking.
Yes, Jackie, we can hear you.
Okay, great. It's me, but I'm in a public building, so I need to have my mask on. First of all, thanks for the invitation from Catherine and Grahame to participate this evening and in this book. When I was first approached, I thought, oh, what's the piece that they're talking about? And it wasn't until a little bit later that I realized that this piece around, as Tyler was saying, around investment or divestment was one of the pieces that was highlighted in this book. So thank you for raising that up and bringing life to this struggle. There's actually a few questions in the chat that talks about this. So I'm gonna try and answer some of those questions directly. You know, one of the questions around long-term accompaniment after a mine closes is the fact that a mine actually never ends, and the fact that Goldcorp has sold now to another company and have kind of tried to wash his hands from the disaster that continues in San Miguel Ixtahuacan years after Marlin has officially closed. The reality is that, back in 2010, and I see we all have like more gray hair, and all the folks that are here when we started doing some of this work, especially around Goldcorp, which was really this moment. And I think in Guatemala around 2004, 2005, when Goldcorp and Sky Resources at the time were getting their licenses to operate, and what was happening behind the scenes, which is part of the story that I was part of, was just also seeing the role that the Canadian government directly through its embassies had in not only promoting, but just making Canadian mining in Indigenous territories a possibility. In my experience, one of my very, very first experiences in Guatemala, I was an intern with the Breaking the Silence program at Tatimagush Center, and we were in Guatemala. We went to the embassy, and the ambassador, the first thing he wanted to meet with us, and the first thing and the only thing he really talked about was how great this mine was going to be in San Marcos. And he handed it out, an op-ed that he had written and published in a Guatemalan newspaper about how beneficial this project was. So this isn't like, Canadian diplomacy standing by and doing kind of just behind the scenes type of work. This is really putting themselves out there for the company. And I think a really interesting thing that folks, if you are not following, one of the really interesting things that happened around Goldcorp was, of course, that in 2010, the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights had been petitioned years earlier by Indigenous communities, Maya Mama and Maya Sipicapense communities, asking that the commission order the Guatemalan state to stop mining in their territory because they were worried about what was happening to their water. They had already seen wells dry up. They were worried about the contamination, and they had nowhere else to go. And the commission, in this amazing resolution, granted precautionary measures to the beneficiaries were folks from the communities. They ordered, and this has never happened to the best of my knowledge in any other case, but they said, Guatemala, shut down this mine until we can make sure that folks have water. And what happened behind the scenes were there's a case currently happening in Canada to try and get access, even just getting access to information, which has been a struggle for years. So this is an important case that JCAP at Osgood Law School is working on, and other lawyers and folks across the country, just to get access to what is it that the Canadian government is doing behind the scenes, not only to kind of do this work, but really opening all sorts of doors. We hear of parliamentarian junkets. Some folks were asking about what was going around the mine in San Rafael, which we're not going to talk too much about tonight. But these are things, these mines are happening not because there's people standing by, but because there's an active Canadian government opening doors and making sure that these mines are moving forward. Once a mine ends up in your community, it doesn't leave. Today we see in Sipacapa, for example, who were part of, so when the commission, I was talking about the commission had ordered the precautionary measures, what actually ended up happening was that we're trying to figure out exactly what happened, but eventually the Inter-American Commission changed that resolution and said that the mine didn't have to shut down, but it had to, the state had to ensure that the affected communities would have access to water. So this was in 2010. The changes happened in 2011. 10 years later, just last week, 14 communities from Sipacapa were at a congressional meeting in Guatemala, called by an ally in Congress to ask the state what has happened to these precautionary measures, and why now that the mine is actually closed, people still don't even have water that they were ordered to have 10 years ago. So the reality of long-term accompaniment is that because mines never go away, the struggle for dignity, the struggle for clean water, the struggles that folks have just to kind of recuperate some of what was taken for them. I remember a woman very fondly, Crisanta, who was this very courageous woman in 2008 who was criminalized in around the Marlin mine in northern San Marcos. And I remember her coming to Canada at one point on a speaking tour, and her talking, about the conflict that even had happened in her family, and that rupture of their community and their family, the lack of water that they had, but also just the sadness to know that their sacred mountain had been turned into an open pit mine, and all that had been lost that can never, ever, ever be recovered, which were the sacred it makes me so mad and also so sad to think of the loss. And when we talk about genocide and ongoing genocide, what does that look like, around Canadian mine sites? And that's what it looks like, the destruction of people's ability to practice who they are and through their traditions and through their spirituality, and not having access to their medicines, and how important that was. I think this is the reality of Canadian mining. And this is what's happening all over Guatemala. I think I don't have a lot of time, but I really wanted to mention that it's really important to note, to remember that the Marlin mine and later, or around the same time when Sky was getting its new license to operate once again, and the murder of Adolfo happened, and the women were so brutally violated around that mine site, and Herman, of course. This is around, this kind of, Canada came to Guatemala to open the doors. It was like, okay, the peace accords are done. Guatemala is open for Canadian extractive business, and this is how we're going to do it. And pension holders, I worked for many years on campaigns trying to get, the United Church pension plan to divest. They came on delegations. They were well aware of what was happening. There was pleas for them, to divest. And this was, my work was focused on the United Church, but of course, lots of churches and lots of unions are still invested in these companies and refuse to divest. Our pension plans. This is so intrinsically part of Canadian identity around extractivism. One time I was in the embassy and the person attending us said, "We're Canadians, we cut down trees and mine. That's what we do." And so this kind of way of seeing this, that's our cosmovision as white settlers living in this society. It's like, go exploit and do whatever you can to make a dollar. So I think it's really important to know that although the Canadian government at around 2004, 2005, 2006 was really pushing for Canadian mining to happen, of course, what we have seen now is that every major mine in Guatemala where Canadian companies have been at play, there are constitutional court resolutions saying that those operations need to be stopped because there was never appropriate consultation. This is happening around the Phoenix nickel mine. This happened in Sipacapa, essentially, which is why mining never got into Sipacapa, thankfully. This is continuing around, the book talks about La Puya, it talks about La Minera San Rafael. And so I think one of the things, maybe just to close, is that Guatemalans, and kind of going back to this point that Grahame was talking about around democracy, and, Guatemalans and Indigenous communities resisting Canadian mining in their territories are doing everything they're told that they're supposed to do. They go to the Inter-American Commission. They file legal challenges to the Constitutional Court in Guatemala. They file complaints to the Public Prosecutor's Office. They do we tried to do a complaint to the OECD National Contact Point, which went absolutely nowhere. So all these mechanisms that have been created, there are no mandatory way to keep Canadian mining companies accountable for the harms that they do, whether it be human rights violations or serious environmental damage. And so this is a Canadian problem. This isn't corrupt Guatemala. This is Canadian companies on the backs of Guatemalans making money and doing this in a way that also just so disrespectful and contributing to this ongoing legacy of colonialism and genocide as a result in Guatemala. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Yeah, I mean, I again, I agree with so much of what you said, and I think also I probably speak for everyone or many of us that share the anger that you described, and also the sadness about what is lost, what is destroyed in these processes. We are running, a little longer than we meant to, because there's always so much to say. We are going to 8:30. We'll make a judgment at around 8:30. If there's a lot of questions to get through and a lot of people still have the energy, then I think we can extend it by 10 or 15 minutes so the questions can be got to. But before we get to the Q&A, we have one more speaker. Corey Wanless is with us. Corey, along with Marie Klippenstein, our co-counsel in the precedent-setting Hudbay Minerals lawsuits. These are obviously very important, and I'm sure that that Corey will speak to that a little bit. So without any other additional ado, Corey, maybe you can speak to your contribution on the legal side and where you see hope for all of this going forward.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tyler, and thanks very much to Catherine and Graham for putting together this this incredible book. As Tyler mentioned, together with Marie Klippenstein, we've represented 13 Mayan Kaqchi individuals in lawsuits against Canadian mining company Hudbay Minerals regarding some pretty serious allegations of human rights abuse. This is the murder of Adolfo Each, who was shot in the head and struck with machetes. This is Herman Chub, who's was shot in the chest. The bullet tore through his back and smashed into his spine. He's now paralyzed from about here down. And 11 women from Lote Ocho who were gang raped by the men sent to evict them from their village. And, this lawsuit's now been going on 10 years. And as I listened to the other panelists, I was thinking about all the ways that they're connected and they've supported us and our clients over the years. Catherine Nolin was on a delegation that I tagged along with way back when as part of the process of meeting with folks in Guatemala. And has been a supporter and an ally ever since. Grahame has been a key supporter and link between us and the clients in Guatemala and played an incredibly important role throughout the litigation. James has taken, he takes beautiful photographs and incredibly powerful ones that have been key in telling our clients' stories again and again. He's done all sorts of different photographs, but there's in particular, there's a portrait of Adolfo that was taken just before he was killed that has been crucial in telling his story to various audiences, including Canadian audiences. He was also there for one of the evictions, not the eviction of Lote Ocho, but another eviction that happened a couple of weeks before, in which houses were burnt to the ground. And those photographs I show every time I speak about the lawsuits. They're incredibly powerful. And Jackie's just done incredible solidarity work for the last decade plus. And the thing about solidarity work is it's mostly about time. The amount of time that Jackie has spent with our clients and supporting our clients in all sorts of different ways, a lot of which were unseen, has been vital. We literally couldn't do without it. In terms of where we're at, litigation is hard, it's slow. But it's working, and there's a little bit of hope. We've been at this for over 10 years, and I guess one success is that we've been at it over 10 years, and despite Hudbay's hiring some very high-priced lawyers and throwing everything they can at the litigation, they've been unsuccessful at getting rid of us. And our clients have set some incredibly important precedents along the way, including most crucially that Canadian mining companies can be sued in Canada for harm that's caused by their subsidiary on the ground in other countries. That has been a precedent that's been used by other communities, and lawsuits are now starting to bear fruit. And it's sort of a good news and bad news story. The good news is that there have now been 2 successful resolutions, settlements in the Tahoe case and the Nevson case, that show concretely that you can sue Canadian mining companies in Canada and actually can get a good result. And the Hudbay cases are going along very well. I guess the bad news story is that there are only only two successful settlements, and sort of only three in total, which sort of speaks to how hard it is, and how many barriers there are that make it virtually impossible to access justice in Canada. But if you can get through some of those barriers, it can be a very powerful tool. And the sort of piece that we're at right now, which is very powerful for our clients, is the discovery process. So these are civil lawsuits. We're suing HUDVE for damages, and as part of the civil law system, HUDVE is required to give to us all sorts of documents that are normally confidential, and some of those are slowly starting to be filed in court, and the ones that have been filed in court and that I can speak about are regarding the evictions that happened in 2007 when Sky owned the company. And I was listening to James talk about Guatemala being in a post-war country, and that reminded me of some of the documents that are now public that show Sky Resources, Canadian company, using as a tactic against folks that were on land that they wanted to mine flyovers with helicopters and planes for basically psychological warfare. They were instructed by somebody who had participated in the Guatemalan Civil War that this would cause terror, and to do it as a way of trying to pressure them off of their land. That's something that they did. They collaborated with the military and police. The military was highly involved in the eviction. More, some of the evidence that came out as part of this lawsuit is that Sky Resources was paying through its subsidiary the police and military, and not in sort of an upfront way. Here's a contract, we're going to pay the police and military to conduct evictions. Instead, it was going through, it was off the books, and it was payments made to intermediaries. And this is the sort of information that comes out in litigation. Things like photographs of the police and military supposedly, doing public order eviction. But before they do it, they muster every day at the mine site itself. They have meetings in the back rooms with the security personnel before they go to the evictions. And of course, these are Canadian companies, and something that has become clear throughout the litigation is how in control the executives in Canada are, and in Sky in particular. It's true in HUDVE as well, but I can speak more on the Sky stuff because of what's already public. They were very, very well aware of what was happening on the ground, and they were the one that was deciding, is there going to be an eviction? When's the eviction going to be? Is there going to be a second round of evictions? They were the ones that were making those decisions. There's always lots to talk about. I think that this is an incredible initiative. Marie and I wrote a chapter on this one that was sort of trying to look forward to how we could make some pretty simple reforms in Canada that would make it easier for communities to sue. It's possible now, but with a few changes, it would be a lot easier. And then hopefully we wouldn't see just sort of 3 lawsuits. There's a lot of issues out there. There could be a lot of lawsuits than there should be. And with a few changes in Canada, we could make our companies much more accountable.
Thanks so much, Corey. Yeah, and I think that's a really great note to sort of use as our transition to the questions. And as I said, we've got officially 10 minutes left, but if folks want to stick around for an extra 10 or 15, I'm sure the panelists won't mind answering a few extra questions. I'm going to start with, I'm pulling together from a few different questions that have come through here, and I'm going to offer this to everyone. Someone in the chat shared a Eduardo Galeano quote, one that we've probably all heard, and it's wonderful, in which he said, "I don't believe in charity, I believe in solidarity. Charity is vertical, it goes from the top to the bottom, but solidarity is horizontal, it respects the other person. I have a lot to learn from other people." That's the quote. And the person who posted that said, "This book is an act of solidarity," and I agree, and every single one of the panelists embodies that spirit. With that in mind, a few questions came through tonight about the relationship between what you've all described in Guatemala and what happens within, the territory that Canada claims to Indigenous nations here. Somebody specifically mentioned, Wet'suwet'en and the link between the repressive tactics that are used in a place like Guatemala and the repressive tactics that are used here, the dynamics between Canadian state institutions, Canadian businesses, executives of companies, and Indigenous nations defending their land, their sacred territory, their political and economic systems right here. So I wonder if anyone on the panel would like to speak to anything around those themes. I think there'd be a lot of interest in that. Don't be shy, jump in.
Let me touch on the solidarity versus charity point directly. And so I appreciate the comment made, and I would just sort of expand it out to the notion of solidarity, but solidarity with the notion of mutual alliance. Because I agree with your distinction between charity versus, which is we help them without questioning the underlying causes. We've got more, they have less. Don't question why, we just help them with a bit. Charitable heart, don't question the underlying causes. And then solidarity, in my sort of 35 or 40 years of activism, takes it to a new level to say, we work in solidarity with them. They are right there suffering the harms, whatever they need and what are doing to defend their rights, their land, their environment, etc. We will be there with them. And then the added point, and I come back to comments that we're trying to set out in the book, is it's a notion I believe strongly with respect to this work in Testimonio and other work, is it's solidarity based on mutual alliances, because these are our problems. So it's not just that we are in solidarity with the people of Guatemala who are being harmed by these companies, by their own regimes, their undemocratic regimes, supported by the US, by the Canadian companies doing business with their economic elites. And they work together as a partnership, sort of a local global partnership to crush the local communities, crush the environment, as Emily was going on about, destroying the mountains to take profits. And that is what it is. But so we're in solidarity with them in any way we can be. Do they need funds? We'll get them emergency funds. Do they need communication devices, iPhones or whatever, so they can communicate with the outside world? We'll help them do that. Do they need human rights accompaniment? We will do that. We'll bring in delegations, etc. Jackie's done tons of this work. Many of our groups have. But it's beyond that, because we're defining it as our problems as well. So as we support them, where they're suffering the harms, the violence, the damages, the environmental harms, defending their lands and territory, we're also saying to them, and we will share your stories, your testimonials, your documentary evidence, but we're going home to fight our battles at home, because these are our problems as well. And we actually work in alliance with them while respecting fully their right to carry out their activism and land defense struggles on their own terms, right where they're living and suffering the harms. I'll leave it at that.
Would any of the other panelists want to chime in on that, or I can
I'll
also
jump
just...
in and say, I'll just say one thing, and Emily might want to jump in too, as she's put her body on the line, both here and there in many ways. But I've been reflecting on, of course, the findings related to the residential schools sites, or so-called residential school sites, and the graves that need to be identified, and so on. And, so much of what Emily and people like Nate Einbinder and Cyril and Sebastian's contributions really, the connections to Indigenous genocide are so striking. And I think the way forward for many of these, I mean, the search for the disappeared and the exhuming of mass graves, returning people to their home communities and so on, is, been going on for, a couple of decades now, and it's slow and critical that the communities are involved. And I think there's an interesting solidarity, kind of learning and sharing, exchanging from Guatemala to Canada on that matter, where I think community organizations and people on the ground, family members, might be able to actually, share that story with families and communities who will be moving through that process here. But also, where I'm situated, northern BC, the Wet'suwet'en struggle ongoing is only, down the highway, 4 or 5 hours from where I am. And when we see the tactics of sending in snipers riot squads and so on, to community protectors and land defenders. It's very similar. And often these are locations where there's not a whole lot of media, where the media is stopped from doing their job, as we've seen in Northern BC. And just these last few days, right, that journalists, people on the ground are being targeted and threatened themselves. So being a journalist exposing this on the ground is pretty dangerous work. So I think the more we shine a light on their work and value it, share it, as we've tried to do, is the way forward.
Yeah, maybe I can just add that we can't say that we're balanced in our power, but where there is a great richness and a strength. I think J.P. LaPlante discovered in his work in the consulta process, and using the tools, the international tools, to define and defend communities. And I've seen that across Latin America now. And I think that we may imagine that here in Canada, we're not going to be affected by this way of living. But I think if we witness anything with the fires and the drought that we experience, these things are all connected. And if we're going to learn to live a different way, then we need to look at the communities that have maintained a right way of living, a right way of thinking, a right way of relating to one another and to their land, despite 500 years of genocide, despite so many wave after wave after wave of destruction, that communities in Guatemala and communities in Canada have managed to maintain their identity and their understanding of how the world works. We need that. We need to recover that. We need to use our tools, our universities, our courts, our churches to reclaim this right way of being, or else there's just no future for anybody. So the solidarity isn't just us rich guys with those poor guys. It's people with incredible histories of resistance, incredible histories of right living that we need to learn from. So, I mean, I've given thanks every day of my life. When I was 21 years old and I tripped and fell into Guatemala and never got out.
The lessons that we learn from solidarity are so important, I think, and I want to mention briefly. It is 8:30, and we still have over 100 people tuned in. So I take that as an indication that there's still appetite to hear one or two more questions. I will note that if any of the panelists want to share, whether it's petitions or specific pieces of information or organizational information, if you want to put the information for Rights Action into the chat, so that if there's any sort of specific things, those can get put into the chat for people that want to, continue into this and follow up in the coming days. In the meantime, I think another question that I want to pull from what I've read, I'm drawing from a question that Aaron has asked, and I'm going to kind of adapt it a little bit. But Aaron is asking about the role of legal work within Canada. And Corey, you've spoken to this a bit already. What I think is really interesting in Aaron's question is this bit where Aaron says, how does legal work within Canada interplay with defense on the land itself? What can local land defense accomplish, and what can mobilization within Canada accomplish? And I guess what I find interesting in this question is the idea that there are, these two quite different sites of struggle, the legal arena and the literal land. And yet, there's clearly, a relationship between the two. So anyone that wants to chime in on the relationship between those two things, and specifically how that takes place in Guatemala and how it can also take place in Canada.
Corey, I would make a brief comment about Guatemala and then leave it to you to follow up in Canada. And Corey can actually comment on this a bit further, but I stand by when I made my comment about that the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits are sort of the exception to the rule of impunity and immunity from liability in Canada. both criminal law liability and civil law liability. That's with respect to holding our corporations and investors and even the Canadian government accountable in our courts for harms and violations in other countries. And so the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits are both, in my view, both enormous and tiny at the same time. And the small point I would make right here is related to that. They're enormous because they haven't been done before. And we need many more of them. And then as a side issue, and we're not even at criminal law yet, when we start seeing members of boards of director go to jail, when we start seeing members of company management from the highest level go to jail through criminal law, that will start to shift things a bit faster than civil law remedies, even though I believe strongly in these lawsuits. And then the point I wanted to make with respect to Guatemala is that these lawsuits are tiny in their legal impact. They do not affect the land struggle in Guatemala. Hudbay and Sky Resources, according to the decision of the Constitutional Court that we were referring to just now, that ordered the suspension of Solway's mining operation, and it continues to operate it illegally, that Constitutional Court decision affects Hudbay and Sky Resources license as well. They never had legal license to operate their mine from 2004 forward, let alone the rapes, let alone the killing of Adolfo Ish, let alone the shooting of Herman Chub and all the others. These lawsuits are civil remedies for 13 cases. And I hope we win, or I hope we get a settlement someday that is fair and just. We might not. We might lose after 11, 12, or 13 years. But if we do, it is absolutely a small but important piece of justice. But it doesn't address the land issue. It doesn't address the economic model. It doesn't address the role of the Canadian government. It doesn't address the issue of the investors behind it. So I think the Hudbay Minerals lawsuits with respect to Guatemala and Canadian law are both huge legally and tiny in what they're actually addressing and achieving to change in terms of Guatemala. I'll leave it at that, Corey. Feel free to differ with me, Corey, on that point, let alone anything else you might want to say.
No. I am 100% in agreement with that. I don't know if this is going to answer the question, a bit of a tangent perhaps, but I mean, when I think of law, I think of it as a tool or maybe as a site of struggle. And in many cases, it's more likely to be a tool of oppression than it is of salvation. But, you know, as with all struggles, those engaged in them, you have to sort of deal with the world as it is. That's the site of the struggle, and the goal has to be to try and use the law as it currently exists, or as it might soon be, to push everything in the right direction. But you know, in this case, law was used originally to justify the forced evictions in the first place. There were eviction orders that were gotten by the mining company through Guatemalan courts and through a highly problematic and in some cases perhaps even corrupt process. But communities in Guatemala are now using Guatemalan law to fight back. There were criminal prosecutions of Minor Padilla. He eventually pled guilty relating to the shooting and killing of Adolfo Leach and the shooting of Herman Chub. There have been some incredible lawsuits in Guatemala to get the mining license canceled. Those have effectively been ignored, which have then caused the communities to do what they're doing now, which is, you know, we tried the courts, we won in the courts, and yet it's not being enforced. So then you've got to return to the original site of actual struggle on the land itself. And you know, everything that Hudbay does is backed up by, justified by law. I mean, as a corporation, they can only exist because of law. They can only do what they do because of law. And then we're trying to use the tools within tort law to try and hold them accountable. So for me, it's a site of struggle. It's a tool, you know, the bargain that we have as lawyers is that we decide that we're going to try and make change within the system. But sometimes, I mean, I kind of think you have to have struggle on all fronts, which means, you know, trying to change the system from within, but also, you know, actually on the ground activism, sometimes trying to change it from without, especially when the laws themselves are unjust.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And there's a ton of questions coming in still, which I'm so sorry that we don't have hours and hours to go through all of them. We probably have time for a couple more. So one that I've noted, it's not a specific question, but it's just asking for a little bit more on the situation on the ground in El Astor right now. I know, Grahame, you talked about it a little bit off the top, and it's been mentioned, but since several people have asked a range of different questions related to that situation, I wonder if any of the panelists wanted to chime in a little bit more on that, and of course tie that into what's already in the book and how what's happening there relates to what we've already been discussing.
I'll just repeat briefly what I said, because we're up to our eyeballs in supporting this right now. I put in the chat two sort of recent background articles. The links are there, and we'll be putting out some more information tomorrow, because since those articles went out 4 days ago and 3 days ago, that same situation, which provides the background to why they're protesting, has got a whole heck of a lot worse, because the Guatemalan regime, the so-called democratic ally, has implemented a military state of siege and sent in massive amounts of soldiers and police. And they're rounding up people right now. They're going house to house. They're doing it illegally by any stretch of the legal imagination. People documented in the book, and other community defenders, Maya, Kekchi community defenders from that region, are in hiding. They're going into the mountains literally with knapsacks to try and hike to remote communities where they might find friends and neighbors who are also Kekchi people. There's a mad scramble for people just to protect and save their own lives. And so we from afar are sending emergency funds as best we can. And then some of the bank accounts we're sending folks money to are being blocked by the regime through nefarious means. And then lots of groups in Guatemala are responding to this and trying to get emergency response. And that's one point. So do follow in the chat, like those articles, and then there's a to-do list in there. If Jackie is still on the line, I think Jackie should put her email address and website and contact information in the chat, because she is in Guatemala and has worked on these issues, and she's on the ground now, and we'll be following up on this, I'm sure. And then with respect to the comparison with what's in the book, I think it's basically an identical story. It's a continuation of the same stories in the book. The facts are slightly different, the dates and names are different, but the model is exactly the same. Hudbay Solway Group, investment group from Switzerland, is acting no differently than the other mining companies in general that are documented in the book, and they're being supported by their own government, Switzerland, by the Guatemalan government, by the Guatemalan military and police, just like all the other mining related struggles in the book. And then quite literally, the Solway investment group related mining struggle is the continuation of the exact same Hudbay Minerals, Sky Resources, Inco story. And so the Kekchi people have 60 years of this nightmare. It is now third generation repression, forced evictions, criminalizations, and killings that are being foisted on them, all in the name of bringing development to Guatemala, all in the name of the rule of law, as Corey said. It is very thick and very complicated situation right now. And through Rights Action and other groups like Jackie, we will be putting out more and more information all the time, and there's lots of activism going on related to all of this stuff.
Does anyone else want to chime in on that? If not, I have one last question. Okay, here, going once, going twice, hearing none. So I'll put one last question out to anyone that wants to take it, and please feel free to take it in any direction that you want. This is partly my own question, I'll admit, but also, I've hedged a little bit from some of the things that have come through. I think Grahame right off the top said something important when he said that these are Canadian problems, and then from there, every speaker, I think, in one way or another, has reinforced that message. So I want to come back to that. Somebody in the chat asked, what can we do? What should Canadians be doing about all of this? Which I think is a very good question. In some ways, it's the most important question. And so I want to put that question to you, but with a sort of extra bit of spice, if you will, from me, which is what should Canadians be doing, and what should Canadians be learning about Canada from this? I mean, this is obviously this is the bee in my bonnet, but there is such a deep-seated belief in the idea that Canada is a force for good in the world, that Canada is a positive player, that maybe mistakes happen. Maybe this company is doing this bad thing someplace, but that's not Canada. As a matter of fact, that's the opposite of what Canada is. We just have to get this company to face some good Canadian justice, because if Canadians knew, and if the Canadian courts knew, and somebody get Justin on the phone. Can we just get Justin on the phone? Justin wouldn't stand for this. Justin is a good Canadian kid. And I think that falls pretty flat for me. So at a deeper level, I guess I wonder what you folks who are so embedded in this struggle, each and every one of you at such an impressive record of being part of struggles against not just Canadian companies, but in many cases the Canadian state itself. What should we be learning from that? Not just what should we be doing, but what should we be learning?
I can take a stab, and I'll keep this brief because a lot of these points have been brought up. In terms of what to do, and I'm going to differentiate between narrow, immediate sense and then loosely called the broader historical pictures, though they're both intertwined. On the narrow sense, the book addresses this in the conclusions, and it sort of divides it along the way that I was trying to make a presentation, that this has to do with Canadian government policy, corporate policy, investor policy, the role of the media, and law or lack of laws, and reform and serious accountability is needed in all these different sectors. And the conclusion of the book does not set out in full detail all the what-to-do list, but those are the target areas. And the point I would make here is that there are groups, people groups, church groups, NGOs, solidarity groups, professors, activists working on all these different elements already in Canada, trying to challenge them on all fronts. And we do have a website that is linked, and Catherine put it in the chat, that we're going to start fleshing out more with links to other organizations, because neither Rights Action or Catherine and her work deal with all these issues. And there's many groups across Canada dealing with them. And then feel free to go to the website about the book. And then also feel free to follow up with Catherine directly, myself directly, or other speakers directly, and ask specific questions. There's a lot being done on all these issues, but there's a heck of a lot to be done. And it's a major problem. And it's a major problem because of what I think would be the bigger issues at play. And that both, I think the book addresses it in part, especially in the historical part, that the long history, and George Lovell refers to it, Emily spoke to it, like the 500 years of history of European imperialism, colonialism, and the settler colonialism in Guatemala, similar to Canada. And then the genocides and ethnicides that happened all along the way. And that what's happening today with respect to the mining companies in Guatemala is a continuation of that. And then in Canada, we're living some of the same processes. We're not, it's slowly trickling its way, in my view, into Canada's sort of mainstream culture, establishment culture, ever so slowly. That really what we are dealing with in Canada is some of the legacy of that long history of settler colonialism, and then before that of British and French imperialism and colonialism. But that for me, Tyler, becomes the takeaway is that I think the mining companies are ongoing imperialism in many ways. It's ongoing political and economic imperialism today. And on the broad level, it should be defined as such. On the narrow level, it should be called holding Canada accountable, the Canadian government, for free trade agreements that are defending this model and promoting it, or for embassy services promoting the expansion of our mining companies. And we need accountability there now. And on the corporate level, we need laws, criminal laws and civil laws at a bare minimum to start going at them hard, to start holding them accountable. And the same thing with investment firms. There needs accountability and standards as to what you can invest in and make profits from. And then on the law reforms linked to all of this, we need the legal reform to facilitate more lawsuits, more criminal prosecutions, et cetera. But it comes right back around to, when you look at the policies in general, Canada, alongside of the United States and other wealthy, powerful nations, continue to act in imperialist ways across the planet today, and self-defining ourselves that way. As gray as one might get into, how do you define imperialism, blah, 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 blah. We are an imperialist country on the planet today, both politically and economically, and not in everything we do around the planet, but in many ways. And mining is just a very brutal and concrete example of that. And that would be how I would link the broader picture with some of the specific elements in terms of what to do. I'll leave it at that.
I just want to say one thing is that we're busy running around apologizing for the horrendous situation of the residential schools. Well, if the planet lasts, we're going to need to be apologizing for this horrendous act of destruction that we're engaging in right now. So I think we need to make the links between horrendous behavior in the past and horrendous behavior now, and how are we going to stop it right now? That's all I have to say. And thank you to everyone.
I'll maybe jump in and or go Jackie, and then I'll go after you.
Sure. No, just really quickly. I mean, I think this is like what Canada does in Canada, and this is what Canada does everywhere around the world. So this isn't like Canada overseas doing these things. We're talking about Guatemala today, and we could be talking about any number of countries throughout Latin America, Africa, Asia. But this is also how the Canadian colonial state works in Canada. We've talked about that a bit already tonight. And I think that's the reality. And you know, when the guy at the embassy said, we're Canadians, we cut down trees and mine. I mean, this is part of the mentality of, this is not just what we do overseas. This is who we are. This is part of this national identity that's kind of sold or upheld. And I think questioning that is the very first place we need to start if you're not already doing that. And I think connecting the struggles, I know for me, going to Guatemala and learning about the genocide made me think about what I experienced as a young person, which was I remember when Dudley George was murdered, and how significant that was to me as a 14-year-old to think, why is this person defending his territory being murdered by the police in Canada? And so those are the things that I think we need to make the connections to and question. And I think our money, where it's going, but also our policies, the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, which brings together like 40 organizations in Canada, have been working to create an ombudsperson with teeth that can actually do something for 15 years. And the Canadian government won't even do that. So if you have hundreds or thousands of people lobbying saying, we don't want, this is not who we want, this, you know, and Canadian, we don't want this. And so what can we do to change? And the government just looks at them in the eye, says that they'll do something, and does nothing. And I think that is something that make this something that people are listening to, you know, talk about this issue, question all those things, especially where your money's going, and how our voices around the table are being heard. And I think, you know, COP26 is coming up next week, and what's Canada's position going to be around that table, and where's really our climate priorities, and where does mining fit into all of that? And I think those are things we don't have time left, you know, and this is one of those things that if we don't start acting immediately, and there's not some reins put on mining companies, it is too late. And I think for me, I know we've talked a lot about legal struggles, and I absolutely agree that they're so important. And they're also part of the same colonial structure that we're trying to support our partners on the ground in terms of respect for their ancestral territorial rights. They shouldn't have to go to a colonial court to have their rights upheld. And so I think there's some pushback, I think, not to the fact that that happens, but what are these systems that we have to go to for there to be justice and accountability? So just questioning some of that, I think, is a good place to start. So thank you very much.
Catherine, do you want to make one last remark?
Sure. Thanks, Jackie, and everyone who's contributed. We've had to say goodbye to James, who had to sign out, but just a couple things. Always it's about education as a university connected person, right? And so what we tried to do at the end of the book, as Graham mentioned, is to have a list of organizations, resources, documentary films, James's website, so mimundo.org. Go and look at his photo essays that document over the last 15 years many of these issues. I always tell students who come with us on field schools that because many of these things are shocking when they first join a delegation or when they take a course on these matters. But really it's a matter of taking like 2 steps more than what's being offered to you in the regular news cycle. It's there, as you've seen by the passion and the work of all the people who are contributing to the chat and people who've been speaking, that there are so many people and organizations that are working on these issues. And so focusing on education, coming with us on a rights action UMBC field course or a rights action delegation, and focus on the good as well. I mean, we're documenting a lot of the bad, but there are people behaving magnificently, and we need to focus on them too.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you all the panelists for all of your really thoughtful comments. I'll close this by saying I was a very young person when I first went on a rights action delegation, and that's when I first met Grahame. And it really transformed my own view of the world, my own understanding of my role as a person, fighting progressive struggles within Canada, what that meant around the world. There's no way I can strongly enough encourage people to look into those kinds of solidarity work, because they make such a difference, and they can really transform your own approach. So the book is Testimonio. It is a phenomenal book, as I described in the blurb that I wrote for it. To read this book is to bear witness to something that you can no longer pretend not to have witnessed once you read it. It is a hard read, but I think a really, truly important one, as was this panel. So thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. More than 100 people throughout most of the evening. So a really, really strong response. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to everyone who contributed to the book. Thank you to Between the Lines for publishing it after it sounds like it was a difficult process to get there. So Between the Lines saved the day there. And I will leave it there. If anyone wants to go into the chat in the last few minutes and say anything else, that's the place. Otherwise, good night.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all. See you soon, Catherine.
See you, Emily.
Love you.
Love you too. See you soon.